So I recently went thrifting and I found this great blazer in this plaid wool. I love it. It's in like perfect condition. But the length is no good for me, so I need to hem it. Hemming a blazer can be a daunting task, but today I'm gonna break it down for you and it's gonna be easy to follow and you're gonna learn how to hem your blazer. So next time you're at the thrift store, grab that blazer because today I'm gonna show you how to hem it. So the first thing we need to do is figure out how much shorter we want this blazer. So I've roughly figured out where I want to hem it. I've put some pins here in this line of plaid. So if I fold it up right here, we can see what a difference this is gonna make if I hem the left side here. Make sure you pin all the way around your blazer, try it on, make sure you like how long it is, because once we cut that fabric off, there is no going back. So I'm gonna put this blazer on the dress form and pin it up so that way you can get a good idea of what you should be doing and it'll be easier for you to see on the dress form instead of me trying to do it on myself. So I have my first pin in where I want it to be for the length in the front, and now we're gonna follow it all the way around, making sure it's nice and even on us. Now it's good to do this in a mirror, put some pins in it. You can always take it off and line it up a little straighter when it's not on you. Also, this is a great time to adjust the coat and make sure that it is even on you. So we all have different shaped bodies, right? And maybe your coat originally was too short in the back. So now is the time that you can make it a little longer for you. Here we go. So now we have it pinned up all the way around the coat. Now we're gonna take it off the dress form, chalk it up, and do a bunch of fun stuff on the table. So now we need to mark the bottom of our hem where we want it finished with our chalk marker or chalk or whatever you have to mark your fabric with. Now there's a few different ways you can go around this. So if you think you had to fold up your hem so it was a little bit uneven in one spot to fit your body, that's totally fine. So mark right where you have it pinned. If it was laying even on you beforehand, you can actually just measure up from the bottom, the distance, and then mark your chalk line so it still stays even. So maybe it was like 2.5 inches. So measure up from the bottom, mark it 2.5 inches. If you have a plaid jacket and the plaid matches up and is straight all the way around, you can go ahead, choose the plaid line and follow that all the way around. And since I have a plaid jacket today that matches up all the way around, I'm going to be following one of the plaid lines. So I'm gonna mark this plaid line here all the way around my coat. I can remove my pins and just put some chalk where that line is so that way I have a little reference point and I don't forget which line it is. And there we go. So now that we have the fold line where we want our jacket to end, we need to add extra to it so that way we can fold it up and sew the lining to it. So if you fold back your jacket, you're gonna notice it has this extra piece of fabric in here that the lining's attached to. So we need to measure this so that way we know how much extra fabric to give it past our chalk line. So I measured mine and I've got about 1.75 inches here. Now you've got a seam here inside too. So you need to feel it and measure and see how much extra seam allowance they give it. This one gave it 1/2 inch. So I've got 1.75 inches here that I need to add to my chalk line. And I get that number by measuring this distance of fabric here that I see on the inside, plus the seam allowance that I can feel. And if you can't feel it, just seam rip open the lining a little bit, and then you can fully measure this piece of fabric. So now we need to add 1.75 inches down towards the hem. And then we're gonna draw another line because this distance that we're adding is gonna end up tucked to the inside. So grab your ruler and start measuring that out and do that all the way around your coat. So now we have our cut line drawn all the way across the bottom of our jacket. There's a few different ways you can tackle this next step. You could seam rip apart the entire bottom and then start cutting off fabric from each layer. But you know what? We're just gonna cut through all the layers because you can totally do that and free open that seam because we're gonna have to cut some off the lining anyways. So get your fabric scissors ready and we're gonna cut through everything. To make this method work, you need to make sure that everything is nice and flat on your lining under your fabric. Weight it down, and now we can cut through all of the layers. And now we're all cut. So So now what we need to do is go back and reinforce these seams because every seam we cut into is going to start to fall apart. So we need to go back, give it a back stitch, continue the seam, and back stitch again. So I would say about the bottom inch, inch and a half of every single seam you cut into on your jacket, you need to go back and reinforce it. So let's head over to the sewing machine and I'll show you exactly what to do. Speaking of sewing, if you're not in Chicago and you want to take sewing classes with me, make sure you check out the Anastasia sewingacademy.com. Link in the description down below. So I'm just going to show you how to do one of these. So we're going to start about an inch and a half back in the seam. Make sure you're back stitching in the existing seam. Come all the way down to the bottom, back stitch, and cut. It's that easy. We're just reinforcing the bottom of the seam that we cut into. And now it's nice and strong. Once you're done reinforcing the seams, we need to check our pocket bags. When your pocket bag is down, is it close to the hem? And when the bottom of your jacket gets folded up, where's your pocket bag gonna be? This one is hanging out below the jacket. We do not want that. So we actually need to make this pocket bag smaller. This is something that you might need to do when you're hemming a jacket. So it looks like I'm gonna be making this one about 3 inches smaller. So what we're gonna do is head over to the sewing machine and we're just going to sew a line across the bottom of the pocket bag. Make sure you're not going through the jacket, just both layers of the pocket bag. So I'm going to sew right where I want the bottom of my pocket to end. We're just going to add a straight stitch here, back stitch at the beginning and the end, and sew all the way across the pocket bag. Back stitch at the end and cut. And you're going to do that to both pockets. Now it's time to cut off that extra pocket bag, and I'm going to be using my pinking shears so that way it doesn't fray any further. But if you just cut it off with regular scissors, I highly suggest finishing that seam, zigzag, overcast, or serge it. Now do the same thing to the other side. Now you can see our pockets are definitely shorter and they're not going past the hem like they were before. Now we're at the point where we're ready to deal with the actual hem of the jacket to make it shorter. So let's get into it. So you're really gonna wanna pay close attention to make sure that this turns out right for you. The first thing I want you to do is take a look at how your jacket was made before. It's a good chance there's a pleat in it here. You're gonna notice that the lining is shorter than the hem of the jacket, and then it folds back and gets sewn into the facing that's right here. So we need to go through all of those steps now. The first thing you wanna do is seam rip about 3 inches of the lining away from the facing on both sides. That's gonna give us enough room to deal with all of our folding. Now we're going to be ironing the hem. We're going to be ironing it up to the hem line that you drew on your coat. So we're doing this because the fabric folding up is going to act as our facing in the jacket, and we need to know where that's going to be. So now it's time to iron at your chalk line that's on your jacket. That's the first line we drew on the jacket, and you're going to iron up the entire hem of the jacket. Okay, we are folding right up at that blue chalk line, and we are going to work our way all the way around the hem, making it nice and creased. When you're at your seams, make sure that they are ironed open. If they're not right now, iron them open first before you fold up and iron down. Now I'm all done ironing. Now we need to cut off some lining fabric. So we always want our lining to be a little bit shorter than the jacket, so that about 1/2 inch. And right now, they're both the same length because we cut them both at the same time. So now what we need to do is go ahead and cut off 1/2 inch on the bottom of the lining. So now our lining is 1/2 inch shorter than our jacket. Now it's time to start sewing it all back together. Now what we need to do is mimic back the front of the facing here. So you'll notice that there's a seam here on the bottom of the jacket, and then it stops right where the facing ends. So now what we're gonna do is figure out the front of the facing here. So now what we're gonna do is take our facing and we are gonna fold it to the front of the jacket. And when we do this, we have that crease line there. That crease line is going to be our new sewing line. So it's all coming together. We are going to pin this together so everything stays nice and flat. Okay, so right where you see that crease line, that's where we're gonna sew because that is the hem of our jacket. And we're going to leave the seam allowance here folded back. So 1/2 inch. And I also want you to not sew all the way down to the edge right now because we still need to get in there to attach that lining. So we're gonna stop right before the seam allowance. Now we're gonna do the same thing to the other side. Now that we have this facing sewn to the bottom of the jacket, right where our fold is for the hem, we're good to go. And we need to cut some of this off because we do not need all of this bulk in the front of our jacket. So let's cut it on an angle, get rid of some of that bulky wool in there. Cut our thread, there we go. Now we're gonna flip it out and we are gonna have a nice corner to the jacket. Check that out. Oh, looks so good. I'm just gonna press it real quick and make it nice and flat. So I did the same thing to the other side and these corners are looking great on both sides of the facing on the inside of the coat. Now we get to sew the lining to the bottom of the jacket. We've got a lot of little details here, so pay attention closely. Now, the lining on my jacket is just fraying like crazy. So I really want to serge this to clean it up so it's easier to work with. Don't have a serger, zigzag, overcast it. Also, because we cut into these seams, they're starting to fall apart. So just like the wool, we are gonna go back and we are going to reinforce these seams here so they're nice and strong. And then I'm gonna finish up the edge of this lining. So you're gonna finish those seams the exact same way we did before. And then if you wanna finish up the edge of that lining, go for it. I'm going to serge mine. So you can see I reinforced the bottom of that seam and I cleaned up the edge with the serge. While I was at the serger, I also finished up the edge of the bottom of my coat here just to make it a little easier to work with. You don't have to do that, but I just felt like it was nicer. We are getting so close to finishing this jacket. This little section here can be a little confusing. So let's take this step by step. So we're going to, fold this up and then essentially we need to sew the lining to the facing and then we're gonna end up sewing the bottom of the lining here to the bottom of the jacket. So let's flip it inside out and go over how to pin the lining to the facing here. So now we're gonna flip it inside out. And now what we wanna do is take the lining and fold it back so that way it's going to end up a 1/2 inch shorter than the hem. So I need to bring this down. So when I fold that back, the lining is now a 1/2 inch shorter than the hem. So now I can go ahead and sew the seam right here. So the facing to the lining with it folded up. We're just gonna sew that down. Now you're gonna do the same thing to the other side. Now that we have the lining sewn in there on the facing, what we need to do is just go back and finish sewing the facing to the bottom of the jacket there. So go ahead, just flip it back out and finish sewing up that seam with the seam allowance folded in. Now you can go all the way to the end. After that is nice and secure there, we wanna make sure that all of the seam allowance is in towards the inside. So we wanna tuck all the seam allowance into the facing here. So that way we're gonna have a nice clean finish. And then after you have all that tucked in, I want you to grab just the facing pieces and we're going to do a little edge stitch right here, just about that 1.5 inches. So that way, later on, when we're all finished and the lining comes up just a little bit, you're never gonna see any raw edges. It's gonna be completely finished. So let's head over to the sewing machine and sew up those little details. So now I'm sewing up the facing to the hem, just that remainder 1/2 inch that I didn't do earlier. And I left that open just so it was easier to sew this lining down. Personal preference. So now I have the lining sandwiched in between the facing and the hem so we can't see any raw edges there. And now I'm going to create a little edge stitch holding all of these layers together. Back stitch and cut. Now let's take a look at what we just sewed up. So we finished sewing the seam connecting the facing to the hem here so it's nice and secure. And then we added the lining in between these two layers and we gave it that little edge stitch. Notice that it does not show on the outside of the jacket. This is still separate. So we just sewed it to the facing and the folded hem, and it looks so nice and professional. You're gonna do the same thing to the other corner, make it nice and pretty. And now we are gonna sew the lining to the hem. Okay, so now what we need to do is sew the lining to the self fabric here at the hem. So we need to sew these two together, but we need to do right sides together, which means we gotta turn this jacket inside out. So we're gonna take the jacket and we are just going to turn the entire jacket inside out, put those sleeves inside of there. Okay, and now we have right sides together. And what we wanna do is match up all of the seams of the lining with the seams on the jacket. So that way nothing gets twisted. And I want you to pin all of those seams first. These are lining up really well, which is great. Now, if you had a jacket that had a flare to it, you might need to take in some of your folded pieces for the facing. They might not be the right size. But we are looking good here. Okay, so everything lined up, all of my seams are matching up, lining to self. So now we're gonna sew a 1/2 inch seam across the bottom, but we have to leave an opening to get this jacket right side out later. I'm gonna leave a good 4-inch opening right here where I chalk, so that way we can flip it right side out. We're gonna start back as far as we can to the corner. You're not gonna be able to start on the exact corner, but start back as far as you can. Add a few back stitches and continue all the way down until you get to your first chalk mark. And I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance because that's what I left for my seam allowance. So I'm at my first chalk mark and I'm going to turn my fabric and sew off of the fabric to create a little right angle and cut. And now when I start at the other chalk mark, I'm going to sew onto the fabric a 1/2 inch and then turn. Those little right angles are gonna help us keep the lining to the inside later. You're only gonna be able to sew so far to the corner, so just sew as far as you can, back stitch and cut. So now we have the bottom lining sewn up. We left our opening to turn it out later. But before we turn it out, we need to tack up this hem because when we're wearing it, it's gonna wanna unfold. So you can blind hem it, you can tack it by hand, but I'm gonna show you how to do it with your machine. So we are going to fold it up right where that fold line is naturally, and you are gonna stick your hand in here and you are going to grab both of these seam allowances here at the fold and pull them out. And now what we're gonna do is just sew those two seam allowances together, and that's gonna keep it tacked so that way when we're wearing it, it doesn't fall apart and open up. And you're gonna do that to all the seams that you have at the hem of your jacket so that way it stays up nice and secure. So let's go over how to do one. So we're sewing the two seam allowances together on top of each other. And we're just doing it to one side of the seam as well. So when this folds back, you can see how they're tacked together in here. And that's gonna hold the hem up. We are so almost done. Let's take a look at the tacks and turn this right side out. And then we just have a little hand sewing to do. So now we have that hem tacked down at all of the seams. So find that opening you left and we are gonna turn the entire jacket right side out through that little opening. And be careful, don't rip your jacket, don't pull it too hard, just take your time. If you need to make it a little bigger, make it a little bigger. And there we go. It's all right side face out. Now what we want to do is give the bottom of your lining here a nice press so that way it's the even amount all the way across the bottom. And then we have to hand stitch this little opening close. So I'm gonna go do that real quick and then I get to try it on. Here it is. It is looking so much better and more proportional on me. I cut off at least 4 inches on the bottom of this jacket. Remember that before look? So long, right? And now it is so much better. Now it's Anastasia length. And we also made those pocket bags shorter so that way we can still keep the pocket but not have it hanging out of the bottom of the hem. Tailoring your own clothes is so gratifying because then you have things that fit you and you get to save money. What was this jacket? Maybe $10 at the thrift store, and now I have a jacket that fits me perfectly. Thanks so much for watching Sewing Anastasia today. If you have any questions on how to hem a blazer, leave it down below in the comments and I will get back with you as soon as I can. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, give it some applause, and let me know what video you want to see next down below in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Sewing Anastasia and hit the notification bells, and subscribe to Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, all the socials, so that way we can stay connected and creative together. And don't forget, if you're in Chicago, come on into the design studio and take a sewing class with me. You can check those out at sewinganastasia.com. And if you're not in Chicago, totally okay. We now have our online sewing school. So check that out at the Anastasia sewingacademy.com. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.